Start this lecture telling you about an event that happened, a story. And it takes place in a busy delicatessen in a section of town that has a high amount of volume. It's a white-collar section of town, and during the lunch rush, this small delicatessen will serve up to 350 individuals in a 2-hour period. And they have these people working the counters. They're called sandwich artisans. Now, sandwich makers have their own terminology. They're artisans. And they make these craft sandwiches and subs for some of the power or working crew that come through. And on this particular day, one of the sandwich artisans, her name is Alicia, she practiced a cardinal sin, which was a young lady came in submitting an order for a gluten-free sandwich, and Alicia failed to exercise the safety policy on ensuring that she pulled a gluten-free roll. And so she gave this customer a roll with gluten who had severe celiac disease. And it caused this customer to become hospitalized. And this customer spent 3 days in a hospital because of the exposure to gluten with her celiac disease. And oh, by the way, on top of that, she's a prosecuting attorney at the law firm down the street. And she just so happened to be hospitalized at the time when her only child, her daughter, was having a destination wedding in Hawaii. So she missed her daughter's wedding. So as you can imagine, there was quite a bit of blowback to the delicatessen. And in fact, it wound up on social media. There was actually a news segment about it. And so, the headlines were that they're trying to kill their customers. So what do you think? How many people think that Alicia, by not exercising this safety step, should be terminated from her position as sandwich artisan? Not a single hand. Either you guys are lying to me, or I'm in a really, really good audience right now, or you know all about Just Culture. So you can imagine the public wanted heads, and whether or not this delicatessen was going to be able to survive, given the lawsuit and the settlement which would unfold. But upon further review, what if I told you, you know the outcome, but what you didn't know is that Alicia happened to be one of the most productive artisans on the team. She makes about twice as many sandwiches as the other artisans do. And on this day, she was asked to cover for the manager who had to go off-site at a meeting, something she's never been asked to do before. And in the fact, at the time when she was processing this order, she was actually serving as the manager and trying to settle an argument between another sandwich artisan and a customer at the same time she was making this person's sandwich. And the normal bread delivery person that drops off the rolls called out sick that day. And the backup driver that came that was unfamiliar with where to put the gluten-free rolls mixed up the shelves that they put it on. So when she went to grab it, she didn't realize she wasn't grabbing a gluten-free roll in the usual spot. And this safety check where they've confirmed with somebody else, I got a gluten-free roll, that's the only verification step this delicatessen uses. And in fact, the manager at the delicatessen realized that when he was there, the employees weren't always using that safety check, so they were drifting away from what the policy was. So when you put this all together, you realize the circumstances that led up to this event, and perhaps we should attribute this to human error. So the manager decided that instead of firing this person, that they have to go back and investigate all the circumstances that led to that particular behavior, which underlies the principles of a just culture. So the story I told you is a fictitious one, but it's in this book called Dave's Subs that I highly recommend. David Marks, who is the author, happens to be one of the founding engineers for Just Culture. He's an attorney and an engineer by trade. And he is the CEO of a firm called Outcomes Ingenuity that does a lot of this training in just culture. And I think you can make the parallels to medicine that we put so much stock on the fact that an error occurred that we rush to judgment and how to what the resolution is going to be or how we treat that particular individual. And I think sometimes we don't realize or we fail to realize that as human beings we're fallible. and people make mistakes. There are human errors involved. And in order to exercise a good, just culture, you have to identify what those underlying latent errors can be and try to fix them in an environment which we know is not perfect. This is what we seek for a just culture, and this is why I think it ties well to leadership, because this has to exist somewhere between blame-free. We don't want people to be blame-free, that you can just come in and do what you want and without any repercussions. But on the other end, we don't want this punitive culture either, where people feel scared to even do anything because they know that they're going to be sanctioned or penalized as a result if they make a mistake. And this is where leadership has to come in to provide this culture where people are accountable, except that they realize that there's things that need to be fixed. One of the best descriptions I ever heard about just culture is that it is an unemotional approach to behavior management. And I'm not going to go through this. Tony did a really nice job of talking about this Venn diagram with just culture and why a high resiliency organization practices just culture. Because again, they're always trying to be sensitive to operations and preoccupied with failure. This is Perrow's model of looking at environments that are both tight in coupling and complex in interactions. So I would submit to you that sandwich artisans are somewhere near here, where it's loosely coupled and not very interactive. And here is cardiac surgery here, next to things such as nuclear power, space missions, military warnings, and aircraft. So you can see we work in a really tight and complex environment. So accidents are inevitable in this type of system. So, and we need to be accountable for those, but at the same time, we need to know why they exist. So what does perfusion safety look like? And there's not a lot of data that we can point to. In fact, this is by one of my colleagues, Joe Sestino, looking at the surveys that were conducted over a 40-year period. And if you look at the math as it's broken down in terms of the number of procedures and reported events, you can see down at the bottom that there is some variance, but across these 4 surveys over this 40-year period, you can see the number of events that take place per 1,000 procedures. And do we spend enough time trying to work on safety systems for these not to happen? Somebody brought up the I don't remember who it was today, about OR fires, right? An OR fire happens 1 out of every 286,000 operative cases. But you'd be hard-pressed to go into an institution that doesn't do an annual fire safety in-service for every single employee. If this is happening once out of every 500 or 1,000 events, are we doing those same types of drills, which gets to what we talked about this morning? And then we need to identify what the near misses too, not just the events that manifest themselves into patient injury, reach the level of the patient, but what about the things that exist under the surface where we know that something could have gone wrong, but it actually didn't. And the number of near misses outweighs the number of major injuries by, in Heinrich's model, 300 to 1. So if we don't have data to report on perfusion accidents, maybe we can report on the culture of safety for perfusion. So this was a survey that was conducted with MUSC students a couple years ago, and they used the AHRQ safety composite survey and customized it per perfusion. So they sent this survey out. There were about 300 or so respondents, and they were all Likert scale questions. And so what you see here are the highest scoring categories. So if you were a respondent and you said either agree or strongly agree, that was the positive, that was the affirmative. So you can see some of the top 10 questions here. A surgical briefing or timeout is conducted before every surgical procedure. Well, 96% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed, yes, that takes place. And so these were the highest scores. But let me show you what the lowest scores were, and you tell me what you see in common here. The lowest score here, with a 28.9% positive response, when a mistake is made but has no potential to harm the patient, how often is this reported? When a mistake is made but caught and corrected before affecting the patient, how often is this recorded? Staff do not feel like their mistakes are held against them. Staff worry that mistakes are kept in their personal file. They worry about being written up. These are the lowest safety scores in this survey. So we have this persistent problem, at least in medicine and maybe in perfusion, about feeling like when we make mistakes, we can't recover from them. And maybe we don't feel comfortable even sharing the ones that don't happen because we don't want to be looked at differently. So maybe it's just the US. So I looked at Australia, New Zealand, and in Australia and New Zealand, they have a perfusion incident reporting system, PIERS. So I look at them as the moral compass for perfusion safety. And Tim Wilcox here has worked with the PIERS system for many years. As an institution, you can submit to it. It is open internationally, although I don't know if they have the same laws and protections that they have here in the US. And so they did a survey across perfusionists, anesthesiologists, and surgeons to ask them, how likely are you to report something that causes harm? And you can see the overwhelming majority would be likely or extremely likely. But if it doesn't cause harm or it's a near miss, how likely are you to report it to somebody else? And you can see now there's a difference. There's a difference in whether or not people feel like they should report something if it doesn't reach the level of the patient. I grabbed the mannitol syringe instead of the bicarb syringe. I almost gave it. Is it a big deal? No, I'm probably not going to say anything to anyone. And then they looked at it and stratified it by profession. And you can see here that surgeons, anesthesiologists, and perfusionists even have different perceptions on what would constitute something that they report. So there's work to be done, I think. And perhaps we work collaboratively together in identifying this. So what exactly is just culture and workplace justice? There are 6 underlying principles that I'm going to share with you today. And I'm going to take an example here, which is texting and driving. All right? So let me share with you hypothetical number 1. An employee driving a company vehicle runs a stop sign. Investigation reveals that an employee was texting while driving, and the coworker, who was the passenger, witnessed it and did not tell the driver to stop. The result is they arrive at their assignment for the day and begin working. So, something bad happened, but there was no harm. Here's hypothetical 2, same situation. Run the stop sign, he was texting, and this time it comes to light because the driver got a traffic ticket. Police pulled them over because they were texting and driving. Here's hypothetical number 3, same circumstance. This time it comes to light because there was a fender bender. That I remember the commercial fender bender. That there was a fender bender. That they had an accident and nobody was hurt, but an accident ensued due to the inattention of the road because they were texting. And here's hypothetical number 4. That this comes to light because there was a serious accident and a member of the community is badly injured. So what changed here? What changed here was the outcome. But the behavior and the choice that was made was the same throughout the 4. So do we handle this as a society? Do we handle this differently based purely on the outcome and not the decisions that were made prior to that? And so that's principle number 1, outcome severity bias. When the leader of the group allows the severity of the outcome level of harm to drive the response to the event. And so sometimes we punish people because they don't deserve to be punished. Maybe we just think about the outcome and say, we've rendered our decision. We're biased in that way. Or if it doesn't happen, no harm, no foul, no big deal. You drive home, an individual decides to have a few drinks and get behind the wheel of the car. And they drive home and, they get home safely and the next day, no big deal and maybe they're likely to do it again. Or somebody gets behind the wheel of a car and drives home. They made that decision, and this time they get into an accident. The decision was still there, that there was a reckless type of behavior that was decided that they were going to exercise when they drove home, knowing that they had alcohol to drink. So outcome bias. And the reason why outcome bias is such a problem is because a lot of times we aren't able to explain human errors and risky behaviors because we just think about the outcome in mind. We don't think about the why. Why was this behavior choice made? And why, in this particular case, is there human error involved because the driver didn't intend to drive through the stoplight? Principle number 2 is we're fallible. We make mistakes. We're human beings. We work in a complex environment. I just showed you that. This is a story that is more local to South Carolina. This is actually an Amtrak train accident that took place in February of last year, of 2018. And this was right outside of Columbia in a town called Casey. And on this particular evening, in the middle of the night, there was an Amtrak passenger train that was traveling from New York to Miami. And unfortunately, while they were traveling through Casey, there were two ground worker crews that were loading up a freight car on an alternate track. And the switches, which determine which direction the trains go, was inadvertently moved. And as a result, the passenger train plowed into the freight train. And the conductor and the engineer of the passenger train died. 116 people were severely injured. And as a result, you can see here that it was quite a catastrophe. You would think switch failures, God, what's the likelihood of this switch failing? In fact, what I'll tell you is there's a light that goes on when you don't have the switch in the proper direction. And on this night, there's two people working. The light was out of order because they were actually upgrading the system. Talk about ironic, right? That the safety light was actually switched off because they were upgrading the safety light, and that contributed to this accident. But you would think, well, switch failures don't happen very often. That's kind of bizarre. They actually happen 1 out of every 3 days. There were 132 switch failures last year. And the reason why you don't hear about them is because either the tracks are clean when the train goes off and it gets back on, or they were immediately identified and fixed before there was catastrophe. So on this particular evening, those two ground crew members had to operate 37 different switches. So now you can see how some of these problems can materialize. And, oh, by the way, Congress passed a bill back in 2008 that said that trains now have to have this PTC, or this positive train control. And they decided by 2015 all train tracks and trains should have it. But it cost too much. So they pushed it back from 2015 to 2018, and now from 2018 to 2020. And this is, people believe, have contributed to some of these accidents. So here you have a system you know is not safe, that's failing, not a lot of redundancy in the backup, and the backup that you did have was malfunctioning that night, and you've overwhelmed the complexity of turning the switches that led to this accident. So what do you think happened to the ground crew as a result of this? They were terminated. They were fired. Human error. So we thought about the outcome and said, we need to let these people go. Now, if nothing had happened like the other 132 times, it wouldn't have been terminated. Principle number 2, as humans, we drift. And so everybody knows who Steve Irwin is. This is Steve Irwin holding his newborn child while he's feeding an alligator. And that might be conventional practice for Steve Irwin, rest his soul. But we drift, that we try to become more and more efficient. Hey, if I tear my pump down a few minutes early, I can get to doing my paperwork and get my pump set up and get out of here. Or, yeah, I know I usually shut the pump suckers off when protamine starts, but the surgeons ask me, and it doesn't seem to be a big deal. I'll leave it on for another moment or two. You see how drift starts to occur. We drift because we try to become more efficient at the things that we do. We take shortcuts. They're called hacks. And drifting has a possibility to lead to error, as you know. There are 3 behaviors. The 3 behaviors are human error, at-risk behavior, intolerable behavior. What's human error? Human error is, something bad happened, it wasn't intended, and in this particular case, when errors occur, we try to take the individual that's involved and we try to console them. I'm really sorry you got into a car accident on your way to work. I know it wasn't what you intended to do. You were just driving through work and somebody hit you, or you hit somebody else. That was an error. We apologize. And at-risk behavior says that you decided to do something you knew was kind of risky, but you thought it was the right thing to do. So, for example, all of you, I'm sure most of you in this room have had that page at the middle of the night, and you're on call. And you call back and you say, this is Dave, the on-call perfusionist, and they say, how fast can you get here? Either there's a patient on the table that needs to be put on bypass, we forgot to call you. There's a patient coding in the unit, needs to be put on ECMO support. So what do? You speed to work, don't you? You drive as fast as you can to work, knowing that you driving fast increases your chances for an accident. But you think it's justified because if I don't get to work as fast as I can, that patient may die. So you justify that behavior. That's an at-risk behavior. And when that happens and something bad occurs, we try to coach that individual to say maybe that wasn't the best approach. And then lastly, we have the intolerable behaviors. These are the things we can't accept. You decided to, have a bunch of alcoholic drinks and get behind the wheel of the car. There's no justification for that whatsoever. In those particular instances, we discipline those people or we sanction those people. As healthcare providers, most of us are between one of these two categories. Very fortunately that, nobody comes to work to hurt an individual. So we see very few intolerable behaviors, but a lot of human error and at-risk behavior. Principle number 4 says that we all have 3 duties as healthcare providers. A duty to produce an outcome, a duty to follow a procedural rule, and a duty to avoid unjustifiable harm. So let me give you a scenario here. A new perfusionist hire, so you hire somebody to your hospital, and in retrospect, it's come to light that they lied on their resume. They're not actually ABCP certified. In fact, they had their AB certification revoked at a prior clinical institution. And an investigation as to why this person was hired, given that they didn't have ABCP certification, has determined that the human resource clerk or manager did not do the proper background check on the employee. So you meet with the HR manager and they explain they never had a perfusion candidate lie about their certification in the 8 years they managed that department. And at the time, they knew the perfusion team was short-staffed. They knew that the HR team was overwhelmed. So the manager told the clerk just to skip the check. That, this isn't a big deal. All of these perfusionists are always certified. I don't even know why we check this. And hospital policies require the check. Both the clerk and the manager were aware that this policy existed. So if we go back and look at the duties, right? So here, the HR clerk did not do the required background check. So that would be duty to follow a procedural rule. The rule is that when you look at somebody's credentials, you do background checks. The manager told the clerk to skip the check. So that might be a duty to provide an outcome. The outcome is that the check should be performed. You should have done it. You shouldn't have told the clerk it wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe they thought they were trying to do the right thing, but this is the outcome that we received. And I don't know what you would call this about the applicant lying on his resume. Perhaps that's duty to avoid unjustifiable harm or an outcome. But you can see how one particular event can be broken down in this just culture analysis. And so the most important part of a just culture is that we do an event investigation. So now we have to go back and ask the whys. Okay? So why did this happen? We look at things such as the cause of the behavioral choice, what the choice was, whether or not it was human error, whether or not it was, here's the undesirable outcome. So we have to fill in with all the information. So we ask things like, what happened? Okay? What happened here is that we hired a perfusionist that wasn't qualified for this position. What normally happens? Well, what normally happens is we do the background check on these individuals. What should happen? Well, what should happen is we should have identified that this person didn't have a BCP certification. And why did it happen? Well, we didn't realize it because the safety step was missed, the check was missed. And then how do we effectively manage it? So there are algorithms on how to exercise these duties. So you can see here, I'll just show you one. There are 3. But if we determine that one of these steps was duty to follow a rule, the first question we ask is, was the duty to follow a rule known to the employee? So did the HR clerk know that they were supposed to do the background check? Yes. Was it possible to follow the rule? Well, you would say yes. I mean, that's the rule. You should be able to follow it. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? Yes. They knew that they were doing this. Did the social benefit exceed the risk? Did they think that they were doing something that was was better off? Did they avoid the rule because they thought they were doing, or did they think that they were going to do something that was going to improve the process? So if that's a yes, then you support the employee. I would probably say no here. But the next question is, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified? If you say yes here, then this is an opportunity that you identify as an at-risk behavior and you coach the employee. Well, from now on, you have to understand these policies exist for a reason. This is the way in which we do it. This is just a perfect example why we follow these policies. If they violated it and they didn't think it was worth it, then you would consider here punitive action. And so you can see how these things lay out. The same can be true for duty to produce an outcome and duty to avoid causing risk or harm. So these types of things are very helpful when you're working with not only employees in your team. I use it with students, with Perfusion students, and as I said, I use it with my kids actually. Not long ago, I was driving with my son in the passenger seat of the car. And, here we're driving and there's a guy in the car next to us that's eating a bowl of cereal while he's driving. Right? So neither hand is on the wheel. I presume his knee's on the wheel, and he's eating a bowl of cereal. So my son points it out. He's like, Dad, your guy next to you is having breakfast. And so here comes the traffic light. And, I knew that this wasn't going to end well, but I tried anyway. I rolled down the window. We don't roll them anymore. We put the window down. And I said, hey, buddy, you think that's pretty safe driving with your cereal? And he looked at me and he told me I was number one, and then he drove off. So he gave me the bird, and I was like, oh gosh, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to drive away, and my son's going to be upset that he said something to me and I said something to the guy. And I looked at my son. My son's laughing his rear end off. He just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. But this is the mentality that, the lens that we see things through now, that we need to be unemotional when we make these behavior decisions because as a manager and as a leader and, you're working with many teams within an organization, and hopefully your organization has this type of culture where you take emotion out of it. You looked at it objectively and say, okay, we understand that sometimes things don't go the way that we want, but why is it, and what can we do, and what can we learn from it? And that brings us to the last principle, which is the proactive learning culture. So you see these as opportunities to improve your practice. Just because it happened with one person, we can learn from this, and so it doesn't have to happen to other people. And so, what I'll leave you with, and in fact, I have a few minutes here, so I do have one other case scenario that I'd like to share with you after the summary slide. I didn't know if I was going to have time or not. But here you see this example of every complex problem, there's a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And you can see here the miracle on the Hudson. If you've seen the movie Sully, I would have shown the video, but when they're in the hearing and they try to break down, and they're telling Captain Sully, you could have gone back to the airport and landed, and then they describe all the circumstances that were involved at that split-second decision when they landed into the water, and they said, well, we had pilots in simulation that were able to do it. Well, what they didn't say is that it took them 16 times to do it safely. And so these are the circumstances, the types of circumstances that we live in. So let me give you one particular exercise, and hopefully this will open up to discussion in a few moments. So it's 4:30 in the afternoon, and the last open heart case, which was a cabbage of the day, is pulling sternal wires together. The perfusionist that finished the case was relieved by the N+1. So we've been talking a lot about the N+1, the late perfusionist. But there was also a pacer lead extraction scheduled in another non-open heart room. Since the cabbage procedure is stable and finishing up, the late perfusionist sends the other perfusionist home. In addition to that, the late perfusionist also calls off the on-call CCP. So there was supposed to be an on-call person that came in to be the closer to finish up. But you know what? The on-call perfusionist has been getting slammed all week on call. The team has been worked pretty good this last couple weeks. Hey, the cases are finishing up. The cabbage was straightforward. So So, we seem to be drying up, they're pulling wires together, I'll send the perfusionist home, and, the pacer extraction's ongoing, but, I'm here and I'm available. So as we move through this, the surgeon performing the lead extraction encounters some difficulty and requests the perfusionist to bring the pump into the room as a precaution. So now we have to bring the pump into the room. Ultimately, the surgeon completes the case without needing CPB support. The cabbage procedure continues closing without issue. As the chief of perfusion, you learn about this incident the next day through casual conversation with the OR nurses. And at your institution, you have the N+1 rule, which is standard number 14. So you know that for lead extractions, they want a perfusionist to be around and available, and we don't let perfusionists, relieve them from a case until the cardiac case until that patient makes it safely into the unit. So here you had a situation where nothing happened, right? Everything was fine. But if the pacer lead extraction goes bad and the perfusionist now, the only perfusionist on campus, is called to action, now you have the cabbage patient that is left untreated. So you go through the process and try to identify what happened, what normally happens, what should happen, why did it happen, and how were we managing it? So how would you institute a just culture principle in this event? Remember, nothing bad happened, right? But this is the severity bias, the outcome bias. If something bad were to happen, that perfusionist would be in a lot of trouble. What do you mean you sent people home and you covered 2 rooms by yourself and you told the call person not to come in? But nothing happened. So as the manager, what do you do? What do you do with that information? Do you let them know, hey, we can't do that? Because, most of the time that won't be a problem, but when it is, it's going to be a real problem. So how, as a manager, do you institute these just culture principles? So we don't have to tackle this, but I wanted to share at least one with you with the time that I have. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.